Right, hello Alistair. I'll just give you some tips on what I did when removing this manifold and blocking the flaps. There is the man on YouTube who does a very good description, but there's a few little tricks that can really help you out. Main tools, 17mm spanner used once, 1/4 inch socket, an extension with a screwdriver adapter, and you have a 7mm, 8mm and 10mm. Now for everything you will be using, well, for most things, especially these peculiar German type bolts, you will be using the 8mm. Fits over them nicely, it's a good job. The gaskets are inlet manifold set here, which is 5 pieces for the inlet manifold plus the main ring which connects to the EGR. You've got the thermostat housing gasket, and then you have these other O-rings for the fuel lines. It's worth whipping the fuel lines off very carefully because they're expensive, and replacing the O-rings, which I used just a very small flathead screwdriver to ease off the original rings. The rings are, the dimensions I can't quite remember now. I think they're 8mm. I will find out for you. I will find out. Now, back onto the car. I removed the left-hand side wheel and plastic inner arch. Small little plastic screws. Remove it, take it off. It will save you a lot of trouble when you actually come to doing the valve disconnection. Right, the valve disconnection, here's what I did, a rough process and tips. Vacuum hose, which is here. Mine just slipped off, pushed over to one side. Next was the coolant hose here, which goes onto the thermostat housing. Small Jubilee clip, again, move that over out of the way. So they're both out of the way now. Then I moved on to the inlet turbo hose, or inlet hose should I say. Clip here, which you'll see, very easy, prise that off. Down at the bottom down here, Jubilee clip, ease it out carefully, take it out of the way. Then we go on to this coolant radiator here, I guess, or heater. It's for the diesel. You have a pipe which runs down to the thermostat housing again. Clip, remove this end of the pipe. The far end, which is a diesel, you have a diesel connector here. Disconnect this and take it away. Another diesel connection here. Disconnect that and just lift it out of the way. Now on this unit here, in the center underneath, is a coolant pipe, water, which comes up from underneath. So I'll give you a tip now. There's 1, 2, 3 bolts on this unit. Remove the pipes, remove the bolts, and just leave it sat there for now. Don't go struggling because it's right underneath. Then we come back to the EGR unit. Disconnect the vacuum pipe, undo the 3 bolts, securing it to the manifold. The exhaust was a little bit tight, the exhaust return for the EGR, but just wiggle this unit and take it off out the way. Now we come to the power steering and the diesel filter. I actually unclipped the diesel filter completely at the top. Now these, you push the clip forwards and inwards, which actually opens up the clip itself, which allows you to remove. You must remove it and lift it and wiggle it very carefully, because if it's been there a while, it will be stuck. Okay, ease it out. Again, O-rings for this, O-rings for this, and at the back on the rear section here, you can replace the O-ring on that too, because you will have to lift this up to remove the filter, which may disturb the O-ring. And to remove this one, this shield here, this shield has 2 M8 bolts. Just loosen them and that will give you access to that part there. Right, then we move on to power steering fuel filter. Power steering reservoir fuel filter. If you look down underneath, 1 here, there's 3 screws on each one which connect to the manifold. The actual center screw links the both together. Just remember that when you're reassembling. And then what I did is I managed to manipulate the power steering slightly so that I could get my hand underneath this and disconnect the cold or the hot water pipe or the radiator pipe that connects to this underneath. So once you have done that, this can then be lifted out of the way completely. Your fuel filter can be lifted out of the way completely. That gives you a large open space now. Then what you will have is you will have 1, 2, 3, 4 bolts on this metal bracket here. You can remove that metal bracket, take it out the way, which will then allow you to remove, not remove as such, but pull this power steering reservoir forward and out of the way. So that has covered that aspect of everything. Now, the manifold itself, you have little L brackets here and at the back of the manifold. Just remove them completely. 1, 2 bolts, just remove them completely. Same at the back. 1, 2, remove. I actually found it easier to go from under the arch and remove this bracket at the back. That just freed up the manifold from this, what looks like a run for the exhaust for the EGR. So that freed up that. So that technically leaves on the manifold, if I remember correctly, 3 bolts, 1, 2, 3, holding the manifold at the top, and 5 bolts, if I remember correctly, at the bottom. Now you can access the bolts on the manifold at the bottom, underneath through the manifold itself from above. The last one at the end here, I found it easier to approach from underneath, from where I'd removed the wheel arch. Saying that, at the end here is a Banjo type fitting, which is connects the diesel pipes to the rail. I actually used the 17mm spanner, put it on, removed and lifted it out of the way, and it gave me much better access to the end bolt, which is holding the manifold at the top. It just made the process a lot easier. I don't know if you can see it. You'll see at the end of my finger there. It's just like a little Banjo fitting. It's very easy to remove, and it saves you a lot of hassle. Now, coming back to the front of the engine, we have the thermostat housing, which some say you don't have to remove. I would say remove it. It's very simple. Connector here, which I removed up past the fuel rail up to the top. Then you have 1, 2, 3 bolts. Now, to remove this pipe is already removed because it's part of your heating system for the diesel. This part here is already removed. You flick this out the way. Then you have the main pipe here, which runs across the front of the vehicle. Disconnect the Jubilee clip, pull that out the way. Now, I did this before I removed the oil filter cap, because obviously we don't want water mixing with the oil filter. 3 bolts, eased it off, removed it carefully, and then obviously this gasket is the one that goes onto the thermostat housing. I couldn't find any torque settings for refitting this gasket housing, so I just matched the existing torque settings for the manifold itself, which I think, if I remember correctly, it was 15 Newton meters. So housing off, out the way, pipes out the way. I found it convenient as well to remove this fuel line, which runs around and down to the high pressure pump. It connects to the filter here and runs through. It just gave me a bit more space, and while you're at it, the same O-rings will fit onto the lower and upper connections on the high pressure pump. I actually did have a leak on this one, so while I was at it, I just removed it. But while we're here, I'll just say clip pushes in, which spreads the arms, and then wiggle this out very, very carefully, because these aren't cheap and these break very easily, these plastic brackets. I didn't touch the ones on the other side, which are locked by a bolt, because they're not getting moved during the process and they weren't leaking. But I have kept the washers just in case. So you have done, this is removed, this is tucked away to the front, fuel filter is removed. Now we have the oil filter. Remove the cap, which obviously lifts the oil filter out at the same time with it. Stuff it with paper to protect it. Obviously the thermostat, when you remove it, let the water fall out first, make sure it's all clear, stuff it with paper. Oil filter remove, stuffed with paper, mechanics paper, to stop any dirt ingress. Then we come back to the manifold. Now if you see on the YouTube video, the man lifts and slides it forward, and what you will find is this connection here and this long like manifold which connects the EGR, the metal manifold, it actually is very, very tight to the plastic manifold. So what I would suggest is, if you come to the rear of that manifold, it's very hard to see, but there is actually it's like an exhaust bracket. There's 2 bolts. I don't have a photo, but what it does is it just releases this large metal pipe. You don't have to undo them all the way, but it just allows it to move to the right hand side slightly, and then that gives you a bit of play with the manifold to ease it out of position. I did access them 2 bolts which are down here from underneath, and they are size 8, which I used a spanner on. It just allowed that little bit of movement which he didn't show, because what you will find is there's an oil cooler down here, and the manifold does scrub on that if you don't have that extra movement. Right, going back to cables. When you start to remove the manifold, you will see there's a single plastic cable sleeving running down through the manifold. Now, if you go underneath, that is in that sleeving, there is a wire that connects to the sump or the engine block. That's a push fit connector. You can reach in from below, because there is no way you will reach from above. Even if you're anorexic, you will never reach down there. Your arms just will not make it. Remove that, and then the other connector is a slide connector or a push connector which goes to the air conditioning unit. Very simple to release from underneath. That's why I suggest you remove the wheel arch liner. Disconnect them, pull them up and through. When I did the manifold, I did use M14 bolts with an M14 tap set. Removed the valves, very simple. Disassemble the connecting rail, 3 bolts for the motor, disconnect the rail. Then when you want to remove the valves, if you look in the top where the valves are, there's a very, very small Allen key. I actually used a flat screwdriver that was filed down to remove the tiny little Allen bolts, and then I literally just broke out the valves. Cleaning, I used diesel followed by petrol just to get the gunk out. It is a messy job. And then the process of putting back, to be honest, it's much easier because you've removed everything. The unknown is much harder than the known. So once you're putting back, things are much easier. But I will say, do not forget the small process with this oil reservoir for the power steering and this little cooler here, because you do have that hose underneath. So what I would suggest is, when you're reversing and putting everything back, do not forget your little connection underneath on this radiator, because there's very little space to get to it and connect it back on. Also, do not do what I did, which is a bit of a silly mistake. I put this bracket on, which bolts to the manifold with 2 bolts, a bolt at the back and a bolt at the front. I actually put that on first and then realized my oil reservoir was still at the front, which meant I had to disconnect the 2 feed pipes, feed them under, reconnect, and then put the oil reservoir back in. It was a bit of a nuisance because I obviously had to empty the oil reservoir first into a little bottle so that it didn't dribble all over the engine. That was the whole process. I kept the existing oil filter. Fuel filter was not touched. I just literally removed the 2 brackets from the top. My fuel line, which connects to that 17mm bolt and Banjo fitting, I did actually replace with 8mm pipe because it was starting to crack where it connects to the Banjo. So that's why this will look slightly different to yours. Again, the thermostat, obviously oil bracket closed up and sealed. Thermostat, the 3 bolts torque to 15, the same as the manifold. Jubilee clips, everything else. Turbo inlet pipe back on. I didn't replace the pipe, the gasket on the turbo inlet pipe. It never needed it. Just cleaned it and greased it. The vacuum pipe back over. Hose pipe back over for the connecting to the thermostat housing. And that was pretty much it, really. It does seem very daunting, but trust me, those few tricks will help, especially the rear, the wheel arch. If you remove this, it makes it much easier to get to the manifold bolt at the bottom of the engine, at the back of the engine, sorry, on the bottom of the manifold. And it also allows you good access to the connections. What else have I forgotten? One other thing, access. Do not forget the connector which connects the activating motor for the valves. It's right underneath. It's very easy to get excited and go whipping out, trying to pull out the manifold and thinking, why is this stuck? Underneath, connected to the motor, obviously, is an electrical connector. I managed to press the clip down and ease it off with a flat screwdriver from above. And then when reverse fitting, I managed to get my hand from this end underneath and clip the clip back onto the motor when it was reassembled. Obviously the motor was not connected to the flaps because they were non-existing, but I thought it just better to keep it connected onto the original manifold where it's nice and secure and the cable works and it fits. Sorry, it's a bit of a boring video, but that's what I used. Again, the tools, this will really save you. Extension bar, 8mm, 10mm, 7mm for the Jubilee clips, 17mm spanner used once for that Banjo at the back. And I must say, if you have an extended 8mm, they're very handy. Just the slightly longer ones. Gaskets, these are for the O-rings, for the fuel, for the diesel connectors, pretty much standard. This is the gasket for the thermostat, and this was the pack which contained 6 in total, 5 for the manifold itself and 1 for where the EGR connects. I hope that helps you. Fingers crossed. Good luck, mate. It's not a pleasant job, but it's worth doing.